Good day. Welcome to post 352, Politics of New State. Study session 1, New States. Introduction. In this study session, we will discuss the global dimension of the new states in terms of lessons learned in recent years. We'll also discuss issues of economic scarcity, poverty, and extreme inequality, and their implications for instability and conflict in developing countries. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to demonstrate the linkage between new states and the international political system. Discuss issues of economic scarcity, poverty, and extreme inequality in the new states. And lastly, assess the implications of these issues for political instability and conflict in the new states. Politics of new states in global context. We are living in extraordinary times. Since the mid-1980s, politics throughout the world has been rocked by dramatic and unpredictable developments. The most visible of these changes were set in motion by the revolutions of 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe that led to the disintegration of much of the communist world. The brick-by-brick dismantling of the Berlin Wall, which had divided East and West in both physical and symbolic terms, that began in November of that historic year, forever recast the political architecture of Europe. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union, once a formidable superpower, had collapsed into 15 troubled republics, including a much humbled Russia. Recent years have also witnessed a seeming flood of history-making events in the developing or third world nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. To cite just a few examples, China, long one of the world's poorest countries, has become one of the world's most dynamic economies. Yet, in 1989, while most other communist-led countries gave way to the forces of democratization, the Chinese army viciously suppressed popular demonstrations in Tiananmen Square and reinforced party dictatorship. In the mid-1990s, Nelson Mandela was transformed from prisoner to president of a newly democratic South Africa. An awkward handshake on the White House lawn between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin in 1994 launched the Palestine Liberation Organization and Israel on a fitful and uncertain peace process in the Middle East. In the last 10 or 15 years, Latin America has changed from being a region dominated by harsh military regimes to one in which nearly every country is either a democracy or can be said to be moving towards democratization. As the world has painfully learned in recent years, freedom, peace, and a reasonable standard of living cannot be built on hope alone. In the developing countries, economic scarcity, widespread poverty, and extreme inequality make it especially hard to turn such dreams into reality. Topping dictatorial regimes often proves less difficult than building new democracies. In many third world countries, the rush to democracy awakens new and restless constituencies with demands that cannot easily be met by the government or the economy. Even in a relatively long established third world democracy like India, religious divisions frequently explode into communal violence that not only threaten the social order but also shake the very foundations of the country's democratic political system. These international changes have had a far-reaching effect on the countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. During the Cold War, the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States was often fought out and contained in the Third World, as in conflicts in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Central America, and Southern Africa. This situation was certainly politically destabilizing for and caused much human suffering in the Third World. But the superpower standoff also gave the developing nations some bargaining power when it came to securing economic or military aid, as the United States and the Soviet Union would allies in the Third World. The end of the Cold War has meant an end to such strategic leverage for the Third World. Indeed, the collapse of communism has diverted economic resources away from the Third World as developed nations and international organizations channel more funds to help the struggling democracies and market economies of Russia, other Soviet successor states such as Ukraine and East Central Europe. On the other hand, one reason democracy has recently been able to spread throughout much of the Third World is that dictators can no longer rely on their superpower patrons to keep them in power for strategic reasons. In short, both the national and international context of politics in the Third World have changed profoundly in the last decade or so. Yet, as we will discuss in more detail later, there remain important continuities in the domestic and global situations of the developing nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America that continue to distinguish them in major ways from the world's economically richer and politically more powerful countries. Third World states. There are many types of political systems in the Third World. The countries examined in this course include an established democracy, India, a new democracy, Brazil, a semi-democracy, Mexico, that has only very recently begun to permit real political competition, a military-created democracy, Nigeria, a Communist Party state, China, and a theocracy, Egypt, in which supreme political power is held by the religious elites. Analyzing the differences among these very types of political systems is one of the most important and interesting tasks in the study of comparative politics. But it's also important to note some of the political characteristics shared by Third World countries that distinguish them politically from the industrialized nations. First, politics and government in all Third World countries are shaped by the basic facts of scarce economic resources, extensive poverty and inequality, and a relatively weak position in the international system. Political leaders in less developed countries simply have fewer options available in resolving problems or in responding to demands from various groups for a bigger piece of the national economic pie. Economic conflicts, therefore, are more likely to lead to violence or repression in Third World states. For example, peasants may rebel in their quest for more land, or the government may violently suppress labor unions striking for higher wages. Corruption, a recurrent theme in the case studies in this book, is also a very serious problem in much of the Third World because officials personally profit from the state's control over the limited economic opportunities. Resistance to democratization in the Third World has often come, as it also did during earlier stages in the political development of Europe and North America, from elites who fear that greater popular control of the government will jeopardize their economic privilege as well as their political power. Second, the political legitimacy of many Third World states is very weak. In other words, most citizens do not have much faith in their political leaders, or perhaps even in the very nature of the political system of their country. They may obey the law, they may even vote, but they do not see the government as being very relevant to their lives or as being able to do anything about their most serious concerns. They may even regard the government as having a negative impact on their lives, and their citizenship in the state may be negligible as a source of their political identity. There are various causes of weak state legitimacy in the Third World. The government may be seen as serving the interests of one ethnic, religious, or economic group more than others, or even actively discriminating against some groups. Economic failure, political repression, extreme corruption, and military defeat may cause people to lose faith in the government. New democracies, which are now quite common in Third World, simply have not had enough time to establish legitimacy in the eyes of their citizens. Whatever the cause, states with weak legitimacy are particularly prone to political violence, radical and sudden changes, such as military coup d'etats and government paralysis. Third, the effective power of government in the less developed countries is often very limited. The state may have little real ability to exert its authority much beyond the capital city and a few large urban centers in the rural areas and small towns where much or most of the population lives. Political life is frequently based more on the relationship between powerful and usually wealthy individuals, patrons, and those they control, their clients, by dispensing favors or instilling fear. In much of the Third World, the formal aspects of government such as laws, parties, and elections are less important than the non-formal politics of patron-client relationship. There are significant variations in how governments in the developing countries face the political struggle over scarce resources, weak legitimacy, and the influence of patron-client politics. But to one degree or another, they all experience these problems in ways that make the Third World state a distinctive and important entity in the study of comparative politics. Politics of new states in transition. Most textbooks and sources in comparative politics have traditionally been organized according to categories that distinguished between industrialized or developed communist and third world or developing countries. This categorization was based in part on distinctive economic features that help characterize political system, a term that applies to broad patterns of interaction among state institutions, economic coordination, and political culture. Economic organization and performance both affected and reflected the realities of politics in these different political systems, the capitalist or market economics and high standard of living in North America, Western Europe, Japan, and a few other countries, the socialist or planned economics of countries ruled by communist parties such as the Soviet Union and China, and the low level of economic development and widespread poverty characteristic of the Third World. Democracy was another dividing line in this way of looking at the nations of the world. The capitalist industrialized countries not only were wealthy, but also were stable, well-functioning, if not untroubled, democracies. Communist systems were unquestionably dictatorial, and third world nations had either personal despots, one-party rule, military regimes, or at best, democracies marred by high levels of social and political violence. The countries included in this text share many characteristics that allow us to identify them as part of the Third World. Politics everywhere in its essentials is much the same. People do not greatly differ. They want security, wealth, and the power through which to get them. They have particular interests and ambitions which they try to achieve, and which in some ways of conflict in others coincide with the interests and ambitions of others. They band together with other people, either as a matter of convenience or as part of more permanent groups to which they acknowledge some kind of loyalty or obligation. Other groups similarly formed they regard with indifference, suspicion, or downright hostility. And in seeking these interests and forming these groups, they gain power over others and are subjected to power themselves, either directly through the imposition of physical force or indirectly through the organization of their surroundings in ways which reduce and perhaps almost entirely remove their capacity for individual choice. Any form of organization, essential though it may be for the achievement of group and individual goals, and the management of conflict between competing interests itself produces inequalities of power and thus further differences of interest between those who have more power and those who have less. Much of what is described in this course as New States politics would therefore be familiar to anyone who is acquainted with the workings of politics in other parts of the globe. What makes the politics of the new states in some measure distinctive is not the nature of the peoples and politicians who take part in it, but the nature of the circumstances in which they find themselves, and even what is unfamiliar may thus for the most part be readily understood by anyone prepared to try to appreciate those circumstances and the kinds of actions to which they are likely to lead. These common circumstances, shared in some degree by a very large proportion of the peoples of the world, in turn divide what the Third World is, and the extent to which it may be taken as a category appropriate to some kind of comparative political analysis. The phrase, the new state, is generally taken, and is taken here to include the Americas south of the United States, the whole of Africa, Asia apart from the Soviet Union, China and Japan, and the Oceanic Islands apart from the Australia and New Zealand. Any book which presumes to distinguish and discuss the politics of this enormous area, encompassing roughly half the peoples in the world and well over half of the independent states, must first make good its implied assumption that this area can be distinguished for political purposes from other parts of the globe, and has some common characteristics which give it some unity. The term itself seems to owe its origin to one of the less useful categorization of the new states: non-membership either of the Western bloc of capitalist, industrialist, and on the whole liberal democratic states led by the United States, or of the Eastern bloc of Marxist-Leninist states led by the Soviet Union. This categorization does indeed provide a reasonable clustering of the states, which this book is about, and has even received recognition from those states themselves, under the heading of non-alignment, which likewise implies a tripartite division of the world in terms of bloc membership and non-membership. The most familiar examples all incorporate some usage of the term development, whether in the form of developing, underdeveloped, or less developed countries, the last of which also appears as the acronym LDCs. The idea of development, or equally often just the word, used without much concern for what it means, but nonetheless carrying ideological overtones, has bedeviled the analysis of third world politics, and in my view has led to a great deal of conceptual confusion and misleading generalization. I shall use it as seldom as possible. Other categorizations draw on the simple poverty of the new state societies, but while this is at least readily comprehensible, unlike development which can mean many different things, and is an extremely important fact about most of them, as a guide to analysis, it points to us in the wrong direction. The fact that some states which seem in all other respects to be characteristically third worldly are extremely rich, including Kuwait, which has the highest per capita income in the world, helps to indicate that poverty itself is not what we are concerned with, while even in those numerous societies where it is extremely acute, it is an outcome of geophysical, economic or political conditions rather than a guide to the common elements which make such societies what they are. Geographical classifications are even less helpful. The term Afro-Asian was once in vogue, but even if one discounts it on grounds of sheer practicality, given the number of additional hyphens needed to incorporate the Caribbean, Central and South America, and the Pacific, it still does not tell us much except where these states are. In a negative way, though, it at least helps to indicate the range and potential variety of the peoples which it includes, and thus helps to dispose of the idea that the new states might be formed as a result of the cultural characteristics of its people. No plausible similarities of indigenous culture could be held to link together the immigrant societies of the Caribbean, the nomads of the Sahara, and the densely populated rice-grain civilizations of Asia. The common circumstances nonetheless exist. What produces them paradoxically is the existence not of three states but of one. The new state is one result of the process by which since the late 15th century the previously scattered people of the globe have been brought together into what is in many respects a single society, economy and political system. By far, the major part of this process has taken place over the last century, while its political aspects with which this course is essentially concerned are the product of the emergence of new states, which except in Latin America have mostly become independent since the Second World War. What distinguishes the new state is its peripherality. Economic peripherality has meant separation from and subordination to the dominant industrial economies which have developed especially in Europe and North America. Though I do not hold the view that all third world states are thereby doomed to a permanently menial economic status, they have entered the world economy especially through the supply of primary products such as minerals and cash crops to the industrial economies, and for the most part continue to be primary export producers. What is distinctive about this productive structure is not that it necessarily creates poverty, since occasionally, as in the case of Kuwait, it can turn a minor trading port into a booming city wealthy enough to command all the benefits that modern technology can provide. But it ties the economy to a global system of production and distribution. In a sense, of course, the dominant industrial economies are no less dependent on this system of production and distribution than are the third world primary producers. Each group of states, for example, has a similar proportion of its national product committed to external trade. But it is the industrial economies which created the system, which developed the technology needed to work it, and which have the sophisticated productive capacity that holds it together. In addition, and at least in part as a result, they are able to assure their people a much higher standard of living than is available to any but a very small proportion of the people of the third world. Social and cultural peripherality is scarcely less important. While third world cultures may have very little in common with one another, what they do have in common is that they are non-Western. That is, this time with implicit racial overtones, which is also sometimes used to denote the new states. Part of what matters here is that third world peoples were physically subordinated to Europe once during the period, that of colonialism, during which the single world system was being created, with the result that European cultural patterns have become superimposed on or have sometimes totally displaced indigenous ones. This is especially evident in the field of language. In some parts of the new states, notably the Caribbean and Latin America, there is no indigenous language, and people speak the former colonial language with varying degrees of local adaptation. There are some areas too, such as the Arabic-speaking states, where an indigenous language has a wide degree not just of domestic but equally of international currency. But in many areas, especially in Africa, but also in parts of Asia, the former colonial language remains the language of government and is equally essential for any contact, social, economic, or political, with the outside world. Learning that language thus becomes the means by which one may acquire some power within one's own society, by acquiring links with similarly equipped compatriots and with the international system. Education is the terminal that connects you with the outside. But this outside connection is not just a matter of learning a language. It also provides, or at least may provide, an entry to ways of doing things which are characteristically Western and which are essential for the control of the technology, that is, this time with implicit racial overtones, which is also sometimes used to denote the new states. Part of what matters here is that third world peoples were physically subordinated to Europe once during the period, that of colonialism, during which the single world system was being created, with the result that European cultural patterns have become superimposed on or have sometimes totally displaced indigenous ones. This is especially evident in the field of language. In some parts of the new states, notably the Caribbean and Latin America, there is no indigenous language, and people speak the former colonial language with varying degrees of local adaptation. There are some areas too, such as the Arabic-speaking states, where an indigenous language has a wide degree not just of domestic but equally of international currency. But in many areas, especially in Africa, but also in parts of Asia, the former colonial language remains the language of government and is equally essential for any contact, social, economic, or political, with the outside world. Learning that language thus becomes the means by which one may acquire some power within one's own society, by acquiring links with similarly equipped compatriots and with the international system. Education is the terminal that connects you with the outside. But this outside connection is not just a matter of learning a language. It also provides, or at least may provide, an entry to ways of doing things which are characteristically Western and which are essential for the control of the technology through which Western superiority has been maintained. Running a machine, or more generally, running a society which is maintained to an important degree by machinery, is not just a matter of learning about a particular piece of equipment. It may also more basically require you to internalize attitudes towards both physical and things which underlie a machine-based culture. In many other societies, a much clearer process of westernization and hence perhaps of alienation from one's own culture seems to be called for. In the field of politics, a especially important aspect of Western technology, and one which is very easily overlooked by those who see technology, especially in terms of sophisticated machinery, is the technology of organization. The capacity to maintain and control large organizations is the base on which any modern society is built. In the economy, this is most obvious in the role of the major corporation employing many thousands of people and extending its operation over many countries and continents. Many new state societies are, by contrast, hampered by the enormous difficulty, grounded in cultural patterns, enormous difficulty, appropriate to small-scale subsistence societies of maintaining institutions which are beyond the effective control of a single boss and which can readily adapt to changes in leadership. Since the largest organization in most third world states is government, this difficulty is especially clear in the maintenance of an effective bureaucracy. The problem is presented in its starkest form when the army seizes power and an essentially bureaucratic organization becomes directly responsible for the political management of the state. Since the political consequences of peripherality are the subject of this book, there is less need to discuss them here. The resulting tension between the international setting of the new state and its domestic peoples, societies and governments not only account for much of what is most distinctive about the actual working of the new state's politics, it also underlies any theoretical attempt to understand it. Implicitly, or more often, explicitly, underlining this was normally a charge of capitalist exploitation as positively creating the poverty of the new state and a belief in fundamental change, usually of a revolutionary kind, as the means by which this should be reversed. This course does not seek to propound any particular theory of the new state politics, nor is it concerned to assess the theories advanced by others. It is nonetheless built about new basic themes which I feel to be important, accounting for much that is most distinctive about the politics of new states and constituting perhaps the element from which a theoretical synthesis might be built. The first, then, is that neither the nationalist nor the internationalist approach is adequate in itself, and that an understanding of new state politics depends on superimposing and integrating the two. The internationalists are right to start by emphasizing the way in which the new state was created, but wrong to assume, as they too easily do, that the relationship of dominance and dependence established through colonialism continue essentially unaltered into the independent state. The external element still, of course, remains. It is usually a significant part in the makeup of third world politics and may on occasion become an overwhelming dominant one, especially in the smaller states. But the internal element, built up of over 6 generations in most of Latin America and suddenly released through the nationalist movement in the territories decolonized a generation or so ago, is usually no less important a part of politics, and often much more so. The term Third World was coined by French authors in the 1950s to draw attention to the plight of the world's poorer nations, which they believed to be of as much global importance as the headline Grappling Cold War and its superpower adversaries. To make their point, they adapted a terminology from the French Revolution. In the mid-20th century, a long neglected and oppressed Third World was struggling for recognition and power, just as the third estate of the common people had done against the privileged and powerful clergy, the first estate, and the nobility, the second estate, in the 1780s. Some people criticize the label as suggesting a numerical order in which the third world ranks behind the first world, that is, the industrialized democracies, and the second world, which once applied to the former Soviet Union and Eastern European Communist Party states. But in its original sense, Third World was meant to embody the struggle of poor nations for empowering in the international system and a fairer share of global wealth. For many, the term remains a powerful symbol of common purpose and determination, and is still widely used to describe the developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We believe that Third World remains a valid and important concept to use in the study of comparative politics. We also use other forms such as developing and less developed interchangeably with third world. When reading about third world, you also may encounter the term South as a way of referring collectively to developing nations in contrast to developed nations of the North. Like third world, South has achieved a certain symbolic importance by conveying the fact that there are enormous differences between the richer and poorer nations of the world. Granted, South is geographically somewhat misleading since there are developed nations in the southern hemisphere, like Australia, and less developed nations in northern parts of the globe, like Afghanistan. The terms third world and south are applied to countries that are all economically poorer than industrialized democracies. But it is very important to recognize that these countries, which contain about 75% of the world's population, are very diverse geographically, economically, politically, and culturally. Some observers have asserted that there is such great diversity in the third world that the concept is outdated because it applies too much similarity in the challenge facing the developing nations and too much unity in their international policies. They point to the enormous differences in levels of economic development among countries usually considered part of the third world. The question whether a country like Bangladesh, with its extreme poverty and overwhelmingly rural population, has much in common with the economically booming and highly urbanized, newly industrializing countries such as the Republic of Korea, that is South Korea, which are usually still considered to be part of the third world. Others argue not for abandoning the term third world, but for taking account of such differences by adding the concept of a fourth world to refer to very poor countries with deteriorating economies. This study session acknowledges the rich diversity of the new states. In fact, the countries to be studied were chosen in part to reflect this variety, as well as to illustrate important issues in the study of comparative politics. Study session summary. In this study session, we discuss that there are many types of political systems in the third world or new states. Analyzing the differences among these varied types of political systems is one of the most important and interesting tasks in the study of comparative politics. First, politics and governments in all new states are shaped by the basic facts of scarce economic resources, extensive poverty and inequality, and a relatively weak position in the international system. Second, the political legitimacy of many new states is very weak. Citizens have little faith in their political leaders and the nature of the political system of their country. Third, the effective power of governments in new states to exert authority is often limited in scope. End of study session 1. Thank you for listening.